Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. I also teach history at Suffolk University. We are a consortium of 70 plus organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Don Ryan. Don Ryan received the History Medal at St. Raymond's School in the Bronx, but then put history aside until his retirement. He spends a lot of time up at Bunker Hill, and he has just written a book, Searching for William Prescott, the Stalwart of Bunker Hill. So, Don, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. So how did you get, so I think two questions I have. Who was William Prescott? Why is there a statue of him? And then how did you get interested in telling his story?
Yeah, great. So I knew very little about William Prescott until I became a volunteer for the National Park Service back in 2018. And have since that time been giving talks and meeting visitors from around the country and really around the world and talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was really my interactions with the visitors that I met with there that prompted me to dig into Prescott's background. I wanted to be an informative docent up there and started doing research, not only about the battle, but as you mentioned, Prescott's statue is the only statue on the battlefield. And it's where a lot of the visitors congregate as they come up from the street and take pictures and strike the pose of Prescott with his sword extended and so forth. And so I ended up doing a lot of work, background work on Prescott. A big turn in that work that led me to the book was that when COVID shut down the park in 2020, I had some extra time on my hands, and I originally thought I would take my notes and maybe write a couple of articles or a small pamphlet of some kind. In the course of still doing some work, I got some encouragement from probably some folks that you know quite well, John Ferling, who's written extensively on the Revolutionary War, and Nathaniel Philbrook, who of course wrote Bunker Hill, Gordon Wood, Christian Despigna, Paul Lockhart, all who have written nice books about the Revolutionary era, said, gee, you're right, Prescott hasn't been written about in a very long time. Here he was the major commander, really, at the battle. I mean, he wasn't the only commander there. John Stark from New Hampshire was there, Israel Putnam from Connecticut, and so forth. But he was really given the orders to fortify and defend Bunker Hill. And so he became the focal point of my work.
Good. Why is there a statue of him? I mean, you said that there were other commanders. You say he was the only one who was there throughout.
That's right.
So when was the statue put up?
So the statue comes quite distant after the battle. The battle, of course, is in June of 1775. And the first really monument that's created up there of any consequence is the Bunker Hill Monument, which was started in 1825, was when they had the cornerstone laid. The cornerstone was laid by the Marquis de Lafayette, who was on a tour. He had come back in his late 60s. He was on tour of the United States, and he came up here, and he was actually part of that. The monument got completed in 1843, but along the way, there was some interest in having a statue done, both of Dr. Warren, and if you go to the park and go into the lodge building, there is a 8-foot marble statue of Dr. Warren there that was done in 1857, I believe. But similarly, the Bunker Hill Monument Association was very interested in having a statue to Prescott, and they ended up hiring William Wetmore Story, who was actually a he went to Harvard Law. And his father
was a justice of the Supreme Court.
That's right. His father was a famous justice. And he was quite an interesting guy because he decided to become a sculptor. They said, well, gee, why don't you do the statue of William Prescott and we'll give you a commission. And he said, I'll do it if I can train myself a little bit better than I am. So he actually went over to Rome, Italy, and studied sculpture there and did the statue in 1880. And it was dedicated in 1881
Mm.
on the anniversary of the battle.
And it is a dramatic pose, unlike a lot of statues at the time, which are kind of static. I mean, he is
Yes.
really active.
Yeah, there are different interpretations of that. I have my own interpretation. A lot of people that I've read, and maybe they're just kind of copying each other, but will say that he has his right arm extended. He has a short sword that signifies his rank, and on his left hand, he kind of holds it up. And they say he's telling the troops not to fire yet, and they're kind of alluding to the don't fire until the whites of their eyes.
Yeah.
I see it as a more aggressive pose because, of course, the British, when they get up in the morning on the day of the battle, June 17th, not expecting to have a battle that day, but seeing hundreds of men up on Breed's Hill, not Bunker's Hill, Breed's Hill, constructing their fort, that they start firing cannon shots from their warships in the harbor. And Prescott is very defiant. He's a 6'2", very athletic guy. He's 49 years old. He's not a spring chicken. And he's, encouraging his men to build the fort and get it done, because he's anticipating that now that the British know they're there and what they're doing, that they're going to come over. And so I see the statue as kind of a challenge to the British. That, and I say this in my book, that when I see the statue, I hear him saying, "We know you're coming. We're going to be ready for you."
Right. Yeah.
That kind of a thing.
This is a fun thing. And years later, a private in the British Army said that he had actually fired at Prescott several times deliberately, but missed him, couldn't hit him, as he is defying the entire British Army. And
there's a great story when the redoubt is being built on Saturday morning, the 17th, and the British are firing cannon and so forth. And Prescott, at one point, mounts the wall of the redoubt. So the redoubt is about 6 feet high. It's a dirt earthworks, and he's walking back and forth, encouraging the men to get the work done. And at one point, he reputedly stops over in the southeast corner of the rectangular redoubt, looks towards Boston, and doffs his cap towards the British. So he's got a lot of chutzpah, this guy. And one of the other reasons I enjoyed getting into him. But in Boston at the time, in Copp's Hill, which is where the North End is, if people are familiar with the North End of Boston, was military governor Thomas Gage.
Right.
And he's up there looking at what's going on through a spyglass. And he has with him an aide, Abijah Willard, who is a loyalist. And he gives the spyglass to Willard and says, "Tell me who's commanding up there." And Willard looks through the spyglass and says, "It's Prescott." And he knows it's Prescott because Prescott is his brother-in-law.
Oh, wow.
Which is really an interesting thing to find out. He had married William Prescott's older sister, Elizabeth. And actually, Willard and Prescott had met in Prescott's home in Pepperell weeks before, where Willard had warned him that given the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which was 2 months earlier, and other things that have been going on, little events, he said, things are getting, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, things are getting kind of testy. And, if there's fighting, you could lose your farm, you could lose your life. And Prescott very famously says, "I have made up my mind on that subject, and I think it's probable I may be found in arms, but I will not be taken alive. The Tories will not have the satisfaction of seeing me hang."
Wow.
So Gage asks asks Willard if Prescott's going to fight, and he says, "Oh, he's an old soldier, but he's going to fight you to his last drop of blood."
Wow.
So that's when Gage decides we must carry the works, and he moves their attack, which had been planned for Sunday, the 18th, up to the day of the battle.
Right. We're talking with Don Ryan, author of Searching for William Prescott, Stalwart of Bunker Hill. And Prescott was an old soldier. He had been at the Siege of Louisburg in 1745, had fought in the French and Indian War in the 1750s, 1760s. So he does have a lot of military experience.
Right. That's correct. He wasn't, I wouldn't call him a professional soldier, but if you look at his ancestry, and I was lucky enough to get access to a genealogical history of the family written by Dr. William Prescott.
Right.
And one of many William Prescotts I found out that you run across when you start digging into these records. But he was a medical doctor who wrote this history back in, I think it's around mid 1800s, 1870, somewhere around there. And you find out that the Prescotts, he can go back in history into the 1500s in England, and his ancestors all had some type of military experience with them. They were, militia leaders in their town. His great-grandfather comes from England via Barbados in 1640 and lands in, this is interesting. It lands in Boston in 1640, John Prescott. And he's a young man. He has a young family. He's kind of seeking his fortune. And he originally lands in or settles in Watertown, just west of Boston, but then moves out to what was then the frontier in central Massachusetts, founds the town of Lancaster, which he names after his town in England. And then the Prescotts eventually are part of the settlers that found Groton and Pepperell and Sudbury and Concord. That whole area is kind of populated with Prescotts.
Interesting.
And so he follows in the tradition of the family. They're all very active, whether it's his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father, all very active in civic matters to build up these fledgling little towns. And then they're in each case they're a like a captain in the town militia, and that's what he becomes in Pepperell.
That is part of your civic obligation and particularly if you're a leader in the town. Exactly. Also, talking about his brother-in-law being on the other side, the Mass Historical Society has the two crossed swords.
That's right.
Can you tell us a bit about that? Those?
Yes, sure. So very famously, the swords that you're referring to are Prescott's sword that he carried in the battle. They called it the thirsty sword because it wasn't a blade sword; it was actually a triangular sword, and so that when you stabbed somebody with it, it would create a gaping hole in it. But that sword and the sword of Captain John Lindsay, who was the captain of the Falcon, one of the battleships in the harbor that was firing cannon up at the redoubt during the battle. Their grandkids, Prescott's grandson and Lindsay's granddaughter, ended up getting married.
Oh, wow.
And the swords ended up in William Hinckley Prescott's possession. He mounted them on a walnut plaque, and it hung in the Prescott home. The Prescott home is still around. It's still occupied.
Yeah, the Society of Colonial Games operates it.
That's right.
And they have a replica, but they think they put the swords at the Mass Historical. Tremendous house. And so this was William Hinckley Prescott was the historian in the 19th century.
He was the historian, famous historian, who unfortunately isn't born until 4 years after Prescott dies. Prescott dies when he's 69, almost 70 years old. And William Hinckley Prescott, who has a phenomenal career as a historian. In fact, every year there's an award in his name given out there. Heather Cox Richardson and Joanne, oh my God, I'm going to lose her name. Harris received the award a couple of years ago. So Joanne Freeman, I should be saying.
Joanne Freeman.
So the swords are there. The last time I was there, they had moved them from where they had been in the front of the building. But it's quite an interesting story. Actually, Lindsay, who of course was the enemy, he ends up coming back to Boston and he settles back here.
Right. We're talking with Don Ryan, author of Searching for William Prescott, Stalwart of Bunker Hill. And Prescott is at the battle from the beginning. I mean, his men are fortifying the hill the night before, and then till the very end. He is one of the last to retreat. So he is there for a long time, and then he goes back. He goes back home, but then he comes back into the army.
Yeah, I'll tell you one other quick story, which, one of the reasons I got interested in him is because of his incredible courage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just displayed at Bunker Hill, and all the people who stood there that day facing off against the British Army had to have a certain amount of physical courage.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned earlier how he said he would not be taken alive. When the British, on their third attempt, eventually get into the redoubt and it becomes hand-to-hand fighting, Prescott, true to his word, is in the fort fighting them, and he's parrying the thrusts of their bayonets with his short sword. His jacket is getting torn by the bayonets, and somehow miraculously he's not wounded, he's not killed or captured. He does escape. He retreats out of the redoubt. The British have taken control.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans, head back to Harvard Square, to the headquarters. He reports to Artemus Ward, who was the major general at the time of the New England troops.
Mm-hmm.
And in an incredible situation, he says to Ward, I did everything I could in my power. I stayed as long as I could, but we became overwhelmed and we ran out of ammunition. But if you give me 3 regiments, 1,000 men, muskets and bayonets, I will go back and recapture the hill, even if I perish in the effort, he tells Ward.
Wow.
Now, that's a pretty amazing statement, and how it demonstrates how much he was into the cause. And Ward won't let him go.
Wow.
But to get to your point, he does stay in the army. He becomes part of the Boston siege. George Washington arrives in Boston on July 3rd, a few weeks after the battle. And he helps Washington, along with others, to put together really the Army of the United Colonies, which is what it was first called until it became the Continental Army. And he's there for the siege. Of course, there was no fighting in the siege. The British, under William Howe, who was the on-the-field commander at Bunker Hill for the British, decide to evacuate the city, and that's what they do. Washington then is going to go down to New York to defend New York.
Right. And
there is a recruiting effort to get soldiers to go with him. And Prescott decides he will sign up for a tour of duty.
Oh, wow.
And he and his regiment march down to New York. There's a lot of marching, Bob, in this area.
There's a lot of marching.
There aren't trains or buses.
That's right. Yeah. And then he did Governor's Island off the tip of Manhattan.
That's right. He and his troop, and probably many of these men have probably never been out of their region. Now they're going to go 200 miles south to fight the British in New York. And Israel Putnam, who has kind of a dubious experience at Bunker Hill. He's actually referred to by some historians as the hero of Bunker Hill. Now, I take issue with that because I think certainly Prescott, and you could add John Stark from New Hampshire, have major roles. Putnam never really is involved in the fighting, but he was there and he was a famous general. And when Washington goes down to New York, he actually puts Putnam in charge of the defense of New York. Charles Lee had been there previously. Washington then puts Putnam in charge, and Putnam assigns Prescott to Governor's Island, which is a 179-acre island off the southern tip of Manhattan. I was just there 2 months ago. I wanted to be on the island myself to see the panorama that Prescott would have seen. Governor's Island sits at the mouth of the East River. So you have Manhattan to the west and Brooklyn to the east. And the thought was, if we can control the entrance there, we can keep the British from sailing their ships up and bombarding the two areas. And this is, maybe, going too much into speculation, but after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I found this is interesting, and it was William Prescott Jr., his son, and Prescott only has only one child, which was very rare for people in that age, particularly a farmer who needs labor. He only had one child. He became a famous jurist. He tells the story. I think this information is at the Mass Historical Society, about how after the battle, Prescott had confronted Putnam. Putnam had come to Prescott just before the battle had started and asked for some men to take all the entrenching tools out of the redoubt and send them back towards Cambridge to protect them, which sort of made sense. Prescott was worried, and rightly so, that the men who took those tools wouldn't come back, and he was already losing people who were leaving the front. And he said that to Putnam, and Putnam said that they would return once they had moved the tools. Well, they never came back. And so after the battle, Prescott confronts Putnam and says, "Why did you not come back like you said you were?" And Putnam says, "I couldn't make the dogs go." To which point Prescott said, "If you had said, 'Come with me,' you would have found enough men." So he really challenges him. He's basically calling him out. And, John Stock referred to Israel Putnam as a poltroon, a coward, from that battle. So in New York, jumping ahead now, Putnam assigns Prescott to this isolated spot out in the middle of the harbor. And I thought, is this a little bit of, payback for some of his comments, or is it just coincidental? Or does he think maybe Prescott's the best guy to do that because, after all, he was in charge of Bunker Hill, and that was a very dangerous situation too.
There are not many officers who are as good at telling their own story as Putnam was. And there's a legend in the town in Connecticut he was from about he had gone into a cave and found a sleeping bear and wrestled the bear. And they said if you didn't believe the story, they would point you to the cave. And so that
that's funny. That's funny. So it's curious because there's a lot of discussion about the decision to fortify Charlestown Heights and where they put the redoubt on Breed's Hill, not on Bunker Hill. And Prescott had gone along. Putnam was very aggressive. He wanted to fight the British. And several times he had demonstrated that. But Prescott went along with him to put the redoubt on Breed's Hill. That kind of precipitated the British coming over that day.
So interesting, the personalities in this. And then after the siege of New York, when the Washington's army is chased across New Jersey in January of 77, he leaves the army.
That's correct. He leaves the army. Incidentally, when Washington does escape with his army from Brooklyn in that famous evacuation in the middle of the night and under fog, when Washington leaves Brooklyn and Howe's troops can't battle them, the last people to leave southern New York is Prescott and his men on Governor's Island. It isn't until 7 o'clock in the morning that they finally decide they can see the British up on Brooklyn Heights. Because it's not that far away, and they get into their boats and sail back and escape. And Washington actually commends Prescott for the orderly retreat up Manhattan Island. But you're right. The Americans are eventually pushed out of Manhattan. Washington is being chased across New Jersey, and Prescott's tour of duty is up, and he decides he's going to go back to Pepperell and go back to his farming, and which he does, only to come out of retirement in September and October of 1777, when Horatio Gates, who's in charge of the New England troops, puts out a call for support because John Burgoyne, the British general who is in Boston at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill, but was not part of it, is bringing his army down from Canada in an attempt to cut off the New England colonies from the southern colonies. And they're very nervous about Burgoyne's activity. Burgoyne has recaptured Fort Ticonderoga and some other forts. He's got 6,000 men. William Howe is supposedly going to be coming up from New York to cut off the New England colonies. And Prescott in Pepperell hears the call, and he volunteers for the army again. And I've seen the muster roll in the Massachusetts archives listing him. and it lists him as a private
Oh my goodness.
because he was a colonel. They list him as a volunteer private, and in parentheses it says former colonel.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
he's 50 years old, and he and about I think it's around 60 or 70 men from his region march 140 miles, out west through Massachusetts, over the Berkshire Mountains into the Saratoga battlefields. They arrive too late. He's not part of the fighting that occurs at Freeman's Farm or Bemis Heights, but he is there for the siege and for the surrender ceremony.
Right. Okay.
In fact, I was just going to say, and I might be jumping around here a little bit for you, but there's a famous painting, the Surrender of John Burgoyne, and it hangs in the rotunda of the United States Capitol, along with a couple of other.
By Trumbull, who also did the death of Warren at Bunker Hill.
Exactly, and that's what I was getting to here. This is a little side story, and in fact, I talked to some people at the Massachusetts Fine Arts Museum about this. So Trumbull, who was a very famous painter, his father was the governor of Connecticut, royal governor, who was the only royal governor to go over to the provincial side of things and became a close friend of George Washington.
And became the elected governor. Yeah,
that's right. So, but Trumbull in 1786 paints the first of what ends up being three paintings of the death of General Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And if you look at that closely, and the one here in Boston is only about 3 feet by 2 feet. It's small. It was commissioned by the Warren family, but his other two paintings are like 10 by 10. They're big. You see all these Connecticut folk prominently displayed. Thomas Knowlton, Israel Putnam, Thomas Grosvenor, they're all there up front and center. And you have to peek over someone's shoulder and you see this little face with a hat on, and that's Prescott. And I thought, oh my God, he's like in the background here in this famous battle. And the story goes that when Burgoyne surrendered to Gates at Saratoga, and Trumbull was going to paint that scene, that he was so embarrassed that he hadn't given Prescott his due in the prior paintings of Bunker Hill, that he puts Prescott prominently in that painting. And you'd have to look at it, and I could point out who Prescott is there. You see his full body. He's carrying a musket. But one of the senior historians in the National Park Service in Saratoga, he and I were chatting, and he said, I could never figure out why Prescott is in this painting, because he didn't fight. I don't think he even shot his musket at all. And I said, I think I have the answer for you. And he kind of chuckled at that.
Interesting. Yeah, he's right behind Daniel Morgan in the Saratoga.
That's right. So you do not. That's right. Yeah.
We're talking to Don Ryan, author of Seeking General Prescott. I'm sorry, I got the title wrong. Searching for William Prescott, the Stalwart of Bunker Hill. Now, Stark leaves the army because he hadn't gotten promoted. Was that a reason for Prescott, or he just thought he had enough? I
don't think so. That's a very good question. You're right. John Stark, who is a fierce fighter and was also a veteran of the French Indian War, and he became the hero of Bennington and all that.
He also comes back for Saratoga.
He comes back, and he plays a big role in the Battle of Bennington and also in Saratoga. But he was upset he wasn't getting promoted. And much like another famous battle commander, Benedict Arnold, who was not getting promoted, despite even George Washington promoting him to the Congress. But Prescott, I never see any indication of him being upset by anything. I think he just has praise for the army. He is very dedicated to the soldiers. In fact, in the town of Pepperell, they put him in charge of helping to take care of the families of veterans. He has a real soft spot for veterans, actually of both sides. If I have time, I can tell you a very quick little story.
Sure.
When he is down in New York, and this is, I think, just before he actually gets over to Governor's Island, there are a couple of provincial government soldiers that are taking a British deserter, and they happen to walk by where Prescott is. And the British deserter says, over yonder is Colonel Prescott.
Mhm.
And so the American troops bring him over to Prescott. And this fellow identifies himself and says, I saw you at Bunker Hill.
Hmm.
And Prescott says to him, well, why didn't you kill me? And this British deserter says, I tried to. I was trying to stab you with my bayonet, and I was very close to you, but I never got you. And Prescott laughed and then said, come with me. And he took him into his tent to give him a treat.
Huh.
So this is just kind of the personality of Prescott. I mean, you pick these little stories up,
Yeah.
and he, he's a man of high integrity, honesty. He's a very simple man.
Mhm.
He's not looking for praise or any of that sort of thing. He would be the last to say, how is it that people don't know me
Yeah.
all these years later? That sort of a thing.
Did he leave much in the way of personal papers, letters, diaries?
Oh boy, now you're really getting to the heart of it, Bob. Unfortunately for me, and maybe this is why not much has been written about Prescott in so long. I mean, the last things I've seen are speeches that were given at the centennial of his death in 1895.
Mm.
But he wasn't really a writer.
Mhm.
He wasn't a letter writer, or he didn't leave a diary.
Mhm.
I did find a few letters here and there.
Mhm.
Actually, some of them are in William Hinckley Prescott's papers at the Mass Historical Society. So it made the work of really trying to find out what I could about him much more difficult. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that the structure of the book changed a little bit as I was going through it. And the reason it's entitled Searching for William Prescott is that I was getting so many questions from people up on the Monument Park.
Mhm.
Who is this person? Where did he come from? Did he survive the battle? What else did he do in the war, if anything? What did he do after the war? And I had the same questions.
Right.
And as I started to look into it, I went on this quote unquote search to
Mhm.
find what I could about William Prescott. And so the book is actually structured in a way, I call it part history, part detective story.
Right.
In an effort to maybe have some broader interest. I actually, in working with an editor, one of the very first questions she asked me when we first started collaborating was, she said to me, "Are you in this book?" And I said, "Am I in this book? No, I'm a narrator here, but this is a history from hundreds of years ago." And she said, "Oh, I was just wondering if I was going to see you in the book."
Mhm.
And that led me to think about, well, maybe I'll put myself in the book, and part of it it'll be kind of the present and the past. And I move back and forth chronologically. When I run into something that I want to investigate, I actually talk about the efforts I've made to try to retrieve information. I can't go through it all, but here it would take too long. But one thing I was able to do in working with the kind people in Pepperell was to go to their Lawrence Library. It's a fabulous facility. Deborah Spratt there is the senior librarian.
Mhm.
And in a sealed room on the second floor, there is a document. It's a large document, and it's town records from 1742 to 1809.
Mhm.
These are the original documents. And I was given a seat at a table in this room, a pair of white gloves that I had to wear, and a magnifying glass, which was worth its weight in gold, because you can imagine what some of these documents were like. They're some of them are fading away, or they're very fragile, and you need the magnifying glass just to try to decipher what's on the page. It almost looks like hieroglyphics. And some of the writing is very flowery, and there are curlicues, and other times it's chicken scratch. But those are some of the original documents that I was able to go through that really provide a chronology of Prescott's involvement in his town and reacting to some of these public events that we've been talking about. It's there that I find out that he's involved in committees that decide who is going to be the Pepperell representative when the U.S. Constitution is sent around to the states for ratification. And they picked Deacon Daniel Fisk who attends the conference, listens to all the arguments. He's one of 370 representatives in Massachusetts that go there. And what's very curious is that, and of course, I kind of skipped over a little bit of Shays Rebellion, and we could jump back to that because that was one of the impetuses for the actual Constitutional Convention. The central part of Massachusetts and the western counties, Berkshire County, Hampshire County, Worcester County, Middlesex County, all vote against the Constitution.
Oh, yeah. The
in
overall
large
vote was 187 to 168, so it was a very
That's
close
right.
vote.
Only 10 people switched over, it's about 3%. Massachusetts would not have ratified the Constitution. And James Madison was afraid that if Massachusetts didn't, then Virginia and New York and maybe some of the others wouldn't either. So it was a critical aspect. I mean, Worcester, I think the numbers were like 43 against and only 7 for. So, and it was the more populous, representatives from the eastern, Suffolk County, Essex County, and so forth that carried the day. But
do you have any sense of how Prescott, what side he would have been on had he been a delegate as opposed to just sending visitors?
Yeah, I have to admit, and I do this in the book, that there are some things that I wasn't able to determine in my search. I said, like any good detective story, not everything gets answered at the end. And there are aspects of his life that are left unknown. What was his opinion about George Washington? How did he feel about the Declaration of Independence and all this sort of thing? You can go on a whole laundry list of things. And one of them to me is about the Constitution. Would he have voted for it? And I came to the conclusion that he would have. And I'm piecing together other aspects of his life and what type of a person he was to say I think he would have supported it. Now it's curious. What I did learn about that convention was that some of the counties actually instructed their representative to vote a certain way before they even went there. And some of them didn't. And Pepperell did not tell Mr. Fisk how to vote. The idea was you go, you listen to the discussion, and then you decide. But there were a fair number of people there who were supporters of Shays Rebellion, who were sent there by their towns to represent them. So the two representatives from Groton voted nay and voted nay. And I think that would have been tough for Prescott to accept.
And then he knew Job Shattuck, and when Shattuck and a group are trying to stop the courts in Concord in 1786, he's involved there.
That's correct. So this is at the point where Prescott is 61 years old. He's kind of settled in his retirement and working on his farm. And of course, Shays Rebellion erupts in September of 1786. And while Daniel Shays gets kind of headline status, we all know it as Shays Rebellion, and he's obviously very active in that. In the more eastern provinces and around Middlesex County, it's Job Shattuck. And the Shattuck family is pretty much as old as the Prescotts are in that area. I went back and looked at the tax valuation of properties through the Registry of Deeds, and found out that there were in the tax evaluation of 1771, there were 21 Shattocks that lived in Pepperell.
Wow!
And where Job Shattuck was in Groton, it was dominated by Prescotts. So they were neighbors; they were close to each other. And William Prescott, Colonel Prescott, had actually recruited Job Shattuck to be a captain in his regiment that fights in the French Indian War and gets him promoted. So they're obviously very familiar with one another. They were friends and former neighbors. But when Shays Rebellion breaks out, Shattuck was very much a supporter of the rebels, the insurrectionists. And the Prescotts were not. I mean, it was really Oliver Prescott, who was William Prescott's younger brother, who's working with the governor to put together the case to have Job Shattuck arrested. And he is arrested. He's one of only 14 of the 4,000 insurrectionists to be sentenced to death. And luckily for him, he doesn't get killed. He eventually gets pardoned.
Right.
About 9 months after he's captured, finally, Governor Hancock, who was reelected, who has been listening to people saying, "Hey, we ought to let Shattuck go." You know,
And
think of it today.
He pardons all. Yeah.
Think of it today. Here's the January 6th insurrectionists that have been sent to prison and so forth. But if you go back to the insurrection of 1786, 87, virtually all of those insurrectionists were pardoned if they took an oath of allegiance back to Massachusetts.
James Bowdoin was tossed out of office along with about 3/4 of the legislature in the wake of their heavy-handed.
And I found a document in a large safe that's in the town hall of Pepperell. One of the people, I give in the book, because I'm in the book talking about some of my efforts. I give a lot of credit to the people that I work with. It does take a village, as somebody once famously said, or maybe a few villages in this case, to get this information. But there was a woman there that I met, Joan Laddick, who works part-time in the town hall, and she called herself the keeper of the vault. And so she invited me up one day, and I went there, and she opened up the big door of this vault. It's like an old bank vault that you'd see in a bank robbery movie. And I went through some files there, and I found a document from March of 1787, and it's Prescott noting that 32 people have met with him and are taking the oath of allegiance back to the state, and 7 of them are Shattocks.
Wow.
In there. So he was involved in that. He had ridden down to Concord, as you were alluding to earlier, to insert himself between Shattuck and 200 to 300 armed insurrectionists who were shutting down the courts in Concord. And there were folks from Concord who were trying to negotiate with Shattuck, but uninvited. William Prescott got on his horse and rode down to Concord, got himself in the middle of it, helped negotiate a settlement so there was no violence that particular day. The court was shut down. Incidentally, his brothers, both James and Oliver, were judges in Concord, and they had fled along with the other jurists because of what was happening there.
Wow.
But, so he's a very active guy. You're getting this picture of somebody who I find, it wasn't just he had one shining moment on June 17th, 1777. Throughout his whole life, he's dedicated to making his state and his town as secure and as prosperous as he can. And so that's why I think he would have supported the Constitution as putting the country on a better footing.
Right. Well, we're looking forward to the book. We've been talking to Don Ryan, who has written Searching for William Prescott, Stalwart at Bunker Hill, which we hope will be out next spring in time for the 250th anniversary of that shining moment, June of 1775.
Exactly.
Great. So thank you so much for joining us, Don, and telling us so much of the story. We look forward to the book and hearing more.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the executive director of Revolution 250. And I want to thank our many listeners around the country and around the world. And if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, or just want to tell us things you want to hear about on the podcast, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And this week, I want to thank our friends in Old Bridge, New Jersey, and Elkhart, Indiana, Great Falls and Helena, Montana, Rancho Palos Verdes in California, Clinton, Massachusetts, and Clifton Park, New York, as well as in Vienna, Edinburgh, Lisbon, and Sydney, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. Now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.